In the last 72 hours, the United States has called for diplomacy with Iran, while simultaneously preparing for a war it may not be able to control. Warships are moving, militias are mobilizing, and behind closed doors, negotiations are already collapsing. The question is no longer whether the situation is escalating. The question is this still diplomacy, or the beginning of a war no one can stop? Within the past 72 hours, the pattern has repeated itself with almost mechanical precision. Senior American officials, including envoys operating through back-channel intermediaries, have communicated a willingness to engage Iran in new talks over its nuclear program. The framing is measured, even the message distilled. The United States is not seeking regime change. It is seeking verifiable constraints on Iran's nuclear capabilities in exchange for phased sanctions relief. Iran's response has been categorical. Tehran rejected any direct negotiations with Washington, calling them, through its foreign ministry spokesperson, a form of political theater designed to justify continued pressure. Iranian officials have pointed specifically to the presence of U.S. carrier strike groups in the region as evidence that American diplomacy is not sincere, that the extended hand conceals a clenched fist. Meanwhile, the military tempo has not slowed. In the past week alone, U.S. Central Command has carried out strikes against Iranian-backed militia positions in Iraq and Syria. American and allied naval forces have conducted what the Pentagon described as freedom of navigation operations near the Strait of Hormuz. Israel, whose strategic relationship with the United States defines much of the regional calculus, has carried out targeted strikes inside Iran's proxy network in Lebanon and Syria, with what analysts broadly assess as tacit American awareness, if not coordination. The diplomatic messaging and the military operations are not separated by pause or hesitation. They are simultaneous, and that simultaneity is not an accident. To understand the contradiction, it helps to resist the instinct to resolve it too quickly, to conclude that one side of the equation must be false. The more difficult and more accurate reading is that both are true at the same time. The United States is, in some genuine sense, seeking a negotiated outcome. The Biden administration spent years attempting to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 nuclear deal. Before those efforts collapsed, the current administration has expressed, through multiple channels, that an Iran with a nuclear weapon is an outcome it cannot accept and does not intend to allow. A diplomatic deal remains, at least theoretically, the preferred path. And yet the United States is also applying military and coercive pressure that makes meaningful diplomacy structurally more difficult. From Tehran's perspective, the logic of negotiating while under military encirclement is not the logic of a good faith partner. It is the logic of a confrontation being dressed in diplomatic clothing. Supporters of Washington's approach would argue this is not contradiction, it is strategy. Maximum pressure, they contend, is what creates the conditions for a meaningful deal. Iran will not negotiate from a position of comfort. It will only make concessions when the cost of not doing so becomes existential. In this view, the military posture and the diplomatic offer are two parts of the same instrument. Critics, both within the United States and internationally, argue the opposite. They contend that military escalation forecloses diplomacy rather than enabling it, that it empowers hardliners within Iran who use external pressure as justification for entrenchment, that it narrows the political space for any Iranian leader who might otherwise seek accommodation, and that it pushes the situation toward a conflict that no one, including the United States, can fully control. Both arguments carry genuine weight, and that is precisely what makes this moment so consequential. To understand what the United States is actually doing as opposed to what it is saying, it is necessary to examine the strategic calculations operating beneath the surface of its public statements. The first is leverage. This is the foundational premise of coercive diplomacy. You do not negotiate from a position of weakness, and you do not allow your adversary to negotiate from a position of strength. The deployment of carrier strike groups, the maintenance of an air presence capable of sustained operations, the ongoing targeting of Iranian proxy networks, these are not preparations for a war that hasn't happened yet. They are, in the logic of American strategic doctrine, the conditions that make a deal possible. Washington is, in effect, saying, we can hurt you more than you can hurt us, and we will continue to demonstrate that until you come to the table on terms we find acceptable. The second calculation is deterrence. A critical element of U.S. policy in the region is ensuring that Iran does not miscalculate, that Tehran does not interpret American diplomatic overtures as a signal of weakness or disengagement. The history of the Middle East is filled with conflicts that began precisely because one side misjudged the other's willingness to escalate. American military positioning is, at least in part, designed to prevent Iran from drawing the wrong conclusions from Washington's desire for a negotiated outcome. The third factor is domestic politics. In the current American political environment, any deal with Iran carries enormous political risk. The institutional opposition to engagement with Tehran from significant factions within Congress from influential lobbying networks, and from a portion of the American public shaped by decades of framing. Iran, as an implacable adversary, constrains what any administration can offer and what it can accept. Military assertiveness provides political cover. It allows an administration to negotiate, if it chooses to, while demonstrating to domestic audiences that it is negotiating from strength, not desperation. The fourth, and perhaps most structurally important, factor is alliance management. The United States maintains two foundational partnerships in the Middle East that pull in directions that are sometimes in tension with each other. Its relationship with Israel is not merely strategic, it is, by any measure, one of the most durable and politically embedded alliances in American foreign policy. Israel views a nuclear-capable Iran as an existential threat and has made clear repeatedly and credibly that it will act militarily to prevent that outcome, with or without American coordination. The United States cannot simultaneously guarantee Israeli security and pursue unconditional engagement with Tehran. Every American signal to Iran is filtered through the reality that its closest regional partner has the capability and, under certain conditions, the willingness to strike Iranian territory directly. The relationship with Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and others adds a further layer. These governments live with the direct threat of Iranian ballistic missiles, Iranian-backed drone attacks, and Iranian-supported destabilization campaigns inside their own borders. They require, and receive, American security guarantees. And they watch American diplomacy with Iran with the same suspicion they would bring to watching a partner negotiate with someone who has threatened their survival. American strategy, then, is not a single coherent line. It is a set of competing pressures, deterrence, leverage, domestic politics, alliance obligations being managed simultaneously, with military power as the most reliable instrument available. Iran's rejection of negotiations is not simply a tactical posture. It reflects something deeper, a worldview about power, legitimacy, and survival that has been hardened by decades of history with the United States. From Tehran's perspective, the 2018 withdrawal of the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal Iran had complied with, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency's own assessments, demonstrated that American commitments could not be relied upon. A deal was made, honored, and then unilaterally abandoned by a new administration. Iran made concessions. It received sanctions and accelerated hostility in return. Why, Iranian officials ask, would a rational actor negotiate a second deal with a partner that violated the first? This argument is not merely rhetorical. It reflects a genuine strategic assessment inside Iran's decision-making architecture. And that architecture is itself not monolithic. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, exercises a degree of influence over Iranian security policy that operates in parallel to, and often in conflict with, the formal institutions of the Iranian government. The IRGC's interests are not purely ideological. They are economic. The sanctions environment paradoxically benefits entrenched interests inside Iran that have built parallel economic structures precisely because of the isolation imposed by those sanctions. A diplomatic opening that dismantled the sanctions regime would also threaten the business model of networks that have grown powerful in its shadow. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has consistently framed negotiations with the United States not as a pragmatic option to be evaluated on its merits, but as a category of capitulation to be rejected on principle. This is not purely cynical. It reflects a genuine reading, shared widely within Iran's ruling class, that American engagement is always conditional, always subordinate to Israeli and Saudi interests, and always a prelude to further pressure rather than genuine accommodation. What Iran is practicing, in the language of strategy, is something closer to strategic patience. The goal is not to win a confrontation with the United States in the near term. Iran's conventional military forces are not capable of that, but to impose sufficient costs on American policy, through proxies and asymmetric pressure, to make sustained engagement too expensive. If the United States cannot stabilize Iraq without Iranian acquiescence, cannot suppress Hezbollah without triggering a wider war, and cannot operate freely in the Gulf without constant threat management, then Iran has achieved a form of deterrence that does not require nuclear weapons, does not require formal negotiations, and does not require any concessions at all. The calculation is that time favors Iran. Enrichment continues. The proxy network expands. American domestic politics makes sustained military engagement difficult. And every year that passes without a deal is, from Tehran's perspective, a year in which its leverage grows. The conflict, whatever its diplomatic framing, that has already spilled far beyond the direct US Iran axis. What is happening across the region is not a set of isolated incidents. It is an interconnected escalatory system, and it is accelerating. In Lebanon, Hezbollah remains the most powerful, non-state military force in the Middle East. Its arsenal, accumulated over decades with Iranian support, includes precision munitions capable of striking deep into Israeli territory. The 2024 exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah did not resolve the underlying tension. They recalibrated it. Hezbollah sustained significant losses in leadership and capability, but the organization has historically absorbed far worse and reconstituted. Iran has every incentive to rebuild Hezbollah's capacity and every logistical capability to do so. The Lebanese front is not resolved. It is suspended. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias operating under the umbrella of the Popular Mobilization Forces have demonstrated both the will and the ability to strike American military positions. The attacks on U.S. bases at Al-Asad and Erbil, the targeting of American personnel through drone and rocket attacks, and the ongoing presence of militia forces in politically sensitive areas of Baghdad have created a security environment in which American forces are perpetually exposed. Washington has responded with strikes of its own, killing militia commanders, attempting to signal deterrence. The cycle has not broken. It has stabilized at a level of managed violence that is always one incident away from something larger in the Gulf itself. The threat architecture has become more complex. Iranian ballistic missiles and drones represent a direct threat to energy infrastructure across the Arabian Peninsula. The Houthi movement in Yemen, which Iran supports materially and politically, has already demonstrated the ability to strike Saudi oil facilities and to threaten commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes, remains the single most consequential choke point in the global energy system, and the one over which Iran exercises a credible, if not absolute, threat of disruption. The danger in this regional system is not that any single actor decides to start a war. The danger is that the system itself generates an escalation that no actor fully controls. A malicious strike that kills American service members, a miscalculation in the strait, an Israeli operation that triggers a response that draws in American forces. Any of these pathways leads to a rapid escalation that outpaces the political and diplomatic mechanisms designed to contain it. The global implications of a full-scale conflict in this region extend far beyond the Middle East. The most immediate and quantifiable impact would fall on energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. A sustained disruption of that corridor, even a partial one, even a temporary one, would produce price shocks of the kind not seen since the 1970s. The global economy, still managing the inflationary consequences of recent supply disruptions, has limited resilience to absorb another major energy shock. Emerging markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which lacked the strategic reserves and fiscal capacity of wealthier nations, would bear the most severe consequences. Beyond the immediate energy impact, the geopolitical reverberations would be profound. China imports more Persian Gulf oil than any other country. A conflict that threatened that supply would force Beijing into a set of choices it has, until now, been able to defer. China has been Iran's most important economic partner in the sanctions era, providing a lifeline through trade and investment that partially insulated Tehran from Western pressure. A US-Iran military escalation would force Beijing to choose, publicly and consequentially, between its relationship with Washington and its relationships with Tehran and Moscow. China has consistently sought to avoid that choice. Russia's calculus is different. Moscow has used the shadow of a potential Middle East conflict as a form of strategic distraction, an ongoing crisis that consumes American political and military attention, strains alliances, and occupies resources that might otherwise be directed toward Europe and the competition over Ukraine. A controlled level of tension in the Gulf serves Russian interests. A full-scale war creates risks that even Moscow would prefer to avoid. The energy price volatility that would result could be destabilizing globally in ways that are difficult to predict or manage. Europe watches with a combination of concern and limited leverage. European governments remain committed, at least formally, to a diplomatic path with Iran. The E3, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have invested significant political capital in the nuclear diplomacy framework. A military escalation would collapse that framework entirely and leave European governments facing both an energy crisis and a migration pressure, should Lebanon and Iraq destabilize further, for which they are poorly prepared. The international institutional framework, the IAEA, the UN Security Council, is structurally limited in its ability to constrain the parties. Vetoes at the Security Council from Russia and China make binding resolutions effectively impossible. The IAEA's technical credibility remains intact, but its political leverage has been consistently undermined by the refusal of major powers to support its findings with coordinated action. What happens next is not predetermined. History at moments like this tends to branch, and the branches are not equally likely, but they are all real. The first possibility is a negotiated de-escalation. Under this scenario, back-channel diplomacy, possibly facilitated by Oman, Qatar, or a European intermediary, produces a preliminary agreement, a freeze on Iranian enrichment at current levels in exchange for partial sanctions relief, and a reduction in US military posture. Neither side gets what it wants. Both sides get enough to justify stepping back. The deal is fragile, contested domestically in both countries, and subject to collapse at any moment, but it holds, at least temporarily. The nuclear clock is paused. the regional proxy wars simmer down, the world exhales. The second possibility is prolonged controlled conflict. Under this scenario, neither diplomacy nor full-scale war materializes. Instead, what has been happening continues indefinitely. US strikes on proxies, Iranian support for militias, Israeli operations in Syria and Lebanon, healthy disruptions in the Red Sea, periodic crises in the Gulf. The conflict is managed at a level of violence that is below the threshold of major war but above the threshold of peace. It becomes the background condition of the region, a chronic instability that all parties have adapted to, and that none has the political will or capacity to resolve. This is, arguably, the most probable scenario. It is also, in some ways, the most insidious because chronic level conflict has a way of suddenly becoming acute. The third possibility is a full regional war. Under this scenario, an incident, a miscalculation, a strike that kills too many people, a provocation that demands a response, produces an escalation that the political leadership on both sides cannot stop or choose not to stop. Israel and Iran exchange direct strikes. Hezbollah opens a sustained front in the north. Iranian-backed forces attack American positions across the region simultaneously. American forces engage in combat, not just with proxies but with Iranian military units. The Strait of Hormuz is threatened or temporarily closed. Oil prices spike. Regional governments face internal instability. The conflict draws in external powers, not as mediators but as participants in what becomes the most significant military confrontation in the Middle East since 1973. This scenario is not the most likely, but it is not theoretical. We return, then, to the question posed at the beginning. Is the United States seeking peace with Iran, or is it escalating a war? The answer, frustrating in its accuracy, is both. American strategy is not, at its core, designed to produce war. The United States does not want to fight Iran directly. The costs, military, economic, political, would be severe and the outcomes deeply uncertain. But American strategy is also not, in any straightforward sense, designed to produce peace. The conditions it has created, military and proxy warfare, sustained sanctions, pressure, are not conditions under which durable diplomatic settlement is easy to achieve. What American strategy, what appears to be designed to produce is a particular kind of managed confrontation, one in which Iran is prevented from crossing certain thresholds, nuclear weapons capability above all, while being kept in a position of permanent pressure, unable to fully stabilize its regional position or translate its influence into the kind of durable security that might make it a less disruptive actor. This is not a strategy aimed at resolution. It is a strategy aimed at control, and the distinction matters enormously. The history of managed confrontations in the Middle East is not encouraging. The assumption that escalation can be calibrated precisely, that pressure can be applied to exactly the degree needed to produce compliance without producing catastrophe, has been falsified repeatedly. Systems under pressure do not always respond rationally. Leaders under siege do not always calculate correctly. Proxies do not always follow instructions. Incidents happen. What the world is watching in the Persian Gulf is not, in the end, simply a confrontation between two states with incompatible interests. It is a test of whether the logic of strategic competition, the idea that force, pressure, and coercive leverage can be used to shape outcomes without producing the very conflict they are meant to prevent, can actually work. That test has not yet been failed decisively, but the margin for error is narrowing. The aircraft carriers are still in the Gulf, the enrichment centrifuges are still spinning, the diplomats are still talking, and somewhere between the talking and the preparation for something far worse, a decision is being deferred that the world will, at some point, be forced to make. Strategic analysis helps us understand escalation, but understanding conflict does not mean wishing for it. History repeatedly shows that war, in any form, carries costs that extend far beyond military objectives. Economic disruption, political instability, and human suffering rarely remain confined to battlefields. Whatever the strategic calculations, the hope remains the same, that tensions are contained before they harden into open conflict, and that decisions made in the first hours prevent consequences that could last for decades, because in the end, no doctrine, no missile system, and no alliance structure can erase the long-term cost of war.